Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Katherine Dee, writer, expert in online subcultures, and also known as Default Friend on Substack. We spoke about why TikTok isn't actually as bad as everyone thinks, how the internet is warping women's sexuality, not just men's, and the phenomenon known as Femcels, female incels. In the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about whether elite culture is moving to the right, even as normie culture is moving to the left. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband, the back catalogue of extended episodes, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Katherine, should we start by talking about TikTok, which I think we also spoke about last time you came on the show, which was
I think we did.
probably about a year ago. Yeah. Why do you think that sort of fears about TikTok that are currently being bandied around in the discourse are overblown?
I think there's this notion that kids log on to TikTok and they're nonstop fire hosed with two things. Impossibly beautiful young women who are, filtered and fillered out the wazoo, and then anti-Zionist propaganda, which is just, it's just not true. I think a lot of the people who criticize TikTok don't use it, and they don't understand how it's different from other platforms that I think did do a very good job indoctrinating young people, like Tumblr, for example, which have been very, very vocal about. I also think they just don't know what kind of content succeeds on TikTok. There is certainly political stuff, but it's not like this nonstop barrage of you should hate Jews, which is I think what people genuinely believe. And if that was really happening, they would have every right to be outraged by that. But in my view, TikTok is a shopping app essentially, and what it drives is adoption of products, of recipes, of different types of foods, of songs. I've spoken about this before, and this has been true for years. What TikTok's really good at is, taking a random product and making it go viral and making everyone buy it. And you could apply that logic to ideological things. But what TikTok also is increasingly pushing is its shopping tab. It wants you to buy things. It doesn't. There is an ideological slant among influencers, but it's not as unforgiving and as prescriptive as I think the press makes it out to be.
My experience of going on TikTok is that because I don't use it very much, it doesn't know me very well. So it's not that tailored to my interests. Instagram is very well tailored to my interests, i.e. my shopping interests. And it basically is really, really good at selling me clothes and baby stuff, which is fine. Honestly, some of the best things I own I've bought from Instagram. I actually don't mind. TikTok doesn't know me that well, which means that I tend to just get served whatever's popular in my area. And yeah, the impression I get is that what's ever popular in my area is just funny or silly or it's like prime time BBC comedy kind of content. It's very mainstream. It's very safe. So I believe that there are areas of TikTok which are deeply sinister, but I've never personally experienced them, and I assume you have to get pretty far, like into the algorithm's clutches before you do.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of weird things, but in the same respect, there's weird things on Twitter or
Oh
X
yeah,
rather. Yeah,
I'm more
there's weird,
familiar with those. Yeah.
right? Um, like there's tons of very strange communities that I've noticed flourish on TikTok more than um, other platforms, like the Reborn community. This is a really strange one. This was this was very popular on Instagram in the 2010s. It's these very lifelike baby dolls. But there's and some people are just collectors, and it's also an art form to make these dolls. And so it's not. I mean, it's not all like women who have trauma of various types who are treating these dolls as children, although that does exist, right? Some of it's their artisans. Um, but that's on TikTok, right? And that tends to be very weird, and people don't know what to make of that. And there's tons of things like that, right? Something very strange about that community is like they will like breastfeed, or they will. As when there was a formula shortage, there's a huge controversy that a lot of these women were buying real formula to feed their dolls.
Do the
Um,
doll? Do the sorry? Do the dolls drink?
no, it's just
Oh, they
it's
just kind of.
delusional.
Okay, yeah, okay, okay.
But
I mean, I
these
thought maybe they'd hooked up some kind of plumbing system for the dolls, so they were actually like consuming formula,
no,
but no, okay.
it's a it's a really weird it's a very weird thing. But my only point is we don't have to go down the reborn doll rabbit hole. But my point is there's all sorts of things. It because the TikTok audience is so diverse, right? It will be mostly what you described. That's sort of like the first layer, and there's different, you know, algorithmic rabbit holes you could fall down, and that does include things as weird as what I just described, and um, you know, people who are both radical leftists and who there's also people on the far right who are on TikTok. But it's just for the most part it's very like normie with like a leftist slant, but particularly in the United States, mainstream culture in general has sort of a leftist slant, and it's not any more than what you would encounter at the grocery store.
Yeah, I mean, particularly among young people, right? So, like, yes, there is a lot of pro-Palestine stuff on TikTok, but I've seen the polling, I've seen what teenagers and 20-somethings think about Palestine. So it's not so, like, that could be completely organic. It doesn't, basically what we're saying is it doesn't have to have anything to do with the Chinese Communist Party, the fact that that stuff is being promoted.
Right. And I don't want to dismiss they had, I do believe they've suppressed anti-Chinese sentiment, and whether or not you think that's an important component of the app, I'll let everyone has their own opinion on that. There's some more sinister manifestations of that, like suppressing what's happening to the Uyghur people. Um, but by the same token, I don't. I think this idea that they're trying to brainwash kids into hating Jews and undergoing medical transition is, I mean, it's a fantasy. It's kind of annoying, right? Because then you can't pick out the real problems.
Well, which is that we're doing that to ourselves. Like, there's no need to have foreign
Right.
agitators. It just happens
Yeah.
spontaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so I don't know if that's good news or bad news exactly about the, the who's actually running TikTok. Um, Something else that have been writing about recently on your Substack in relation to weird internet stuff is um, AI boyfriends. So a big conversation around what the kind of AI future is bringing to us. I'm actually someone who's a bit skeptical about whether the AI future is bringing anything to us, because I look at the way that birth rates are going, and I know that low birth rates are associated with economic stagnation and technological stagnation. And I actually think a far more likely outcome is that we're just going to stay exactly where we are technologically, or maybe regress, but that's another conversation. Um, Lots of conversation about whether or not all of these tragic incels are going to be seduced by AI girlfriends, and it's going to be like a whole other level of porn addiction, except it's with the girlfriend experience version, etc., etc. And you made this really good point, which is that actually AI boyfriends are probably going to be much better. Like they could plausibly provide a much more realistic boyfriend experience in terms of what women want. Can you explain your thesis?
Especially, so there's sort of two prongs of this. First of all, we already know that young women they become very immersed in fandoms, and we know that even middle-aged and older women, they love like erotic literature, right? And AI kind of allows an expression of both of these things.
AI could do
So
an amazing job at making that because it's very formulaic and kind of
yeah,
market driven. So if AI was just able to pluck out the components that are clearly pleasing the market, then like you're away.
right.
You've got a
So if I mean
bestseller.
if you're this sort of like archetypal lonely girl boss that social media loves so much to poke fun at, right? And you would have 20 years ago been super into 50 Shades of Grey or Twilight. I mean that's what I think the real utility of like an AI boyfriend will be. And there's other like again like stranger expressions of this. I've noticed like people who are really deep in different like anime fandoms or even like weirder fandoms than that, which I won't open up that Pandora's box. I'm stopping myself now, right? They get to like role play with their favorite characters in a way that's more realistic than if another person was playing the character, and that can become addictive. And you see that with there's a program called Character AI, which the chatbot is modeled after fictional characters, sometimes historical figures, and their subreddit, for example, is just filled with people who are talking about some of them feel like, oh, now such and such a character from Has Been Hotel or One Piece or whatever can now be my boyfriend. I see more talk about something called fictosexuality, and I think I may have like helped push that actual label into the discourse a little bit because I wouldn't shut up about it for months.
Meaning
Um,
someone whose sexual orientation is directed towards fictional characters.
yes,
Right.
and they feel that their primary attraction is towards physical is towards fictional characters.
And
You see some of that.
is it overwhelmingly girls and women?
No, it depends on where in the world they are. It in Japan, where there's been like people have been studying this for decades. It's there is a large population of women who fall under the description, but there's also a lot of men. But the culture there is a little bit different. There's more of a tradition of animism in Japan. And there's certainly some men, but the fictosexuals I've observed and spoken to here are mostly young women, like very young, anywhere between 14 and their early 20s.
And what do you think's going on? Why is it that they just consume so much fanfic that it takes over their sexuality, or do you think there's something particularly appealing? That's actually the same question. Like I'm guessing that this all comes via fanfic, fictosexuality.
Not always. No, I mean it's a component of it. I'd say that fanfic was probably like a proto expression of it for some people. Um, but I mean uh, it's definitely part of fan work. I mean, my impression is, especially interviewing some young women who identify as fictosexuals, is that they're very lonely and they're very rejection sensitive, and they don't know how to read people. A couple of people I've spoken to have identified as autistic, and I think that I don't think it's just sort of this like, oh, I feel awkward, I'm autistic. I think they really are autistic. And if you look at studies like people who form romantic attachments with uh, non-humans, right? And I don't mean like bestiality here. I mean like someone who feels like they're in love with their car, right? Objective sexuals, or people who think they're in love with an anime character, they tend to be autistic. Um, and so there's two things going on here. It's one, it's this feeling of separation from human connection, this desire and deep desire for it, and then having this incredible opportunity to explore your own imagination, and never having that, nothing putting a stop to that. So you become completely immersed in your own imagination. And I think for a lot of people, that's what the internet is. I mean, that's the danger of the internet, that it's ultimately like this huge text based role play, right? And that's actually like a part of the reason I'm more supportive of like TikTok than I was of Tumblr, which is because um, even though video isn't real life, I think it introduces an element of reality that isn't there in text, where your imagination really runs away with you, and you can completely get lost in it.
Yeah, so TikTok doesn't quite make you touch grass, but it's like it's part of the way there. It has some basis in reality in a way that's also true for Twitter, which is mostly text based.
I think with Twitter though, you would be surprised. Like something I observed with Twitter is people are acting out um, these deep fantasies, right? But you don't clock them as fantasies because we think of Twitter as like, oh, I'm coming as myself and I'm participating in discourse. But really, like, these Twitter is this like incredible. Twitter's like a chat room. It's this incredible opportunity to build build an identity, and then a lot of the tension is, do people see me as I'm declaring myself, right? And then when there's not, that's when you get people having these meltdowns,
Yeah, because people are refusing to accept the role.
right?
Yes, and it is interesting that TikTok doesn't actually do that, although, and I guess Instagram to a lesser extent, although there's all this stuff that I've talked about on this podcast quite a lot about body image and, seeing all these beautiful women like paraded in front of your eyeballs all day if you're a teenage girl isn't isn't very good for you. Although I have noticed on TikTok that again, the extent to which I peruse it, it's surprising how often women, for instance, will go on TikTok without wearing makeup.
Oh yeah. I mean, you can be quite popular and like, I don't want to sound rude, but like you could be a TikTok influencer and be just like conventionally ugly, right? Just straight up like, or old or disabled, or I mean, just not fit conventional beauty standards. There's like a thirst for authenticity that wasn't there for Instagram. So whereas like I completely buy the argument that like Instagram, um and even sometimes Twitter, but we don't have to get into that, can like encourage a negative body image because you're constantly seeing these just like incredibly beautiful women all the time, and you're also seeing them get rewarded for it, right? You're seeing like their simps or like the gifts they receive. There's not First of all, there's not a culture of that on TikTok, at least not as much. And it's it takes all types on TikTok. And a lot of the power users, the sort of the influencers that have accrued enough of a following where it doesn't matter which algorithmic slot you've been thrust into by the app. People you'll see regardless who have like 20 million followers. Beyond that, they're not always beautiful. They're not always superstars. Sometimes they're 98 years old.
Just I don't want to get too far away from fictosexuality because this is really interesting. We talk a lot about the way, well, I talk a lot about the way that porn is influencing men's sexuality, and everyone is familiar with incels, and this whole idea of men being sucked into the internet vortex is, we know about this. We don't talk about this as much in relation to women. And now one interpretation of that is because it doesn't happen as often to women because women can easily get sex, but women can't necessarily easily get romance, right? That's not actually necessarily available to all women if they're less attractive for whatever reason. And I I suspect that actually the internet has an enormous effect on the sexuality of women who spend a lot of time on it. But it's more covert. I don't know, like we just don't talk about it so much. But I mean, fictosexuality would be one weird manifestation of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it impacts women's sexuality in a number of ways. One, I do think there's sort of like a pornified dimension, and we saw that a lot with Tumblr, right? So this idea of like, uh, increasingly wanting to emulate a little girl, or like these like young aesthetics, because that really is rewarded online. Youth more than uh, conventional beauty, which I think is actually more disturbing, right? Something that I've noticed over time, and I've been looking at this community, obviously not in a professional capacity, but uh, I mean, since it's been on my radar since I was like 8, right? Like the eating disorder community, so like pro Anna, right? It went from being a space that was really sort of dark and disturbing to wander into, but it was really for people who were suffering, and it was for people who were it was for women by women, and occasionally there would be a man, but they would it would it was really about the disordered eating. And then over time, like fetishists infiltrated, and there was still this culture of like, this is a space for women, and the older women would protect the younger women from these predators who would try to infiltrate these forums. And over time, what happened is it was less the barrier to enter these communities started to lower, um, and it started both like merging with other communities, and also there seemed to be this acceptance that people could see you, and it became more sexualized over time. And now when you look, and this isn't true of all, of every part of the wider like eating disorder internet, but there is this element and this awareness that men may be looking at my body, and so what might have been sharing, I don't want to use the word like progress, but like scare quotes progress, if your weight loss with another woman who has an eating disorder, now there's this element of I might be sexualized, and I want to look good. I want to look not good, but I want to be a sexual object, which I think is one way that the internet has impacted sexuality. And I think that that's sort of spread, right? And you see this sort in some subcultures, you see this return to sort of like raunch culture, right? Where like, Jessica Simpson was considered fat. Britney Spears at one point was considered fat. And you see that attitude sort of ironically and less ironically adopted. Um, and this idea of like, I have to be a perpetual little girl. And I think that's the most, that's one of the most like pornified expressions, um, of how it's impacted female sexuality. But also, to go back to fictosexuality, to go totally off the rails here. I mean, I could speak on different ways it's impacted women's sexuality for 45 minutes, right? You opened up the door for femcels, and I didn't even touch that.
we'll get on to femcells, don't worry.
But for to go back to fictosexuality, I mean, there another very weird thing is happening is you have people, and I really relate to this because I mean, at various points in my life, I've haven't been a fictosexual, but I've certainly like fallen into this sort of mindset, thankfully to a lesser degree than some of the more extreme examples I point out on my blog. But it's like you're completely immersed in your imagination, and you could insulate yourself from rejection, right? And so it's very similar to the woman who might become immersed in erotic literature or just a fandom in general. And because I have this theory that if you don't have physical world sex, your tastes become increasingly strange, right? Because they don't literally mean what they mean, right? If someone says, if like someone deep in fandom is, for example, a fandom pairing you'll see a lot is like incest, right? But you don't understand the gravity of what incest is and how disgusting and disturbing it is because you're only learning about it and being exposed to it through this very weird lens, right? And so your sexuality kind of like warps under the weight of the fiction, kind of, right? And you think you're interested in things you're not, but it's actually that they have like symbolic meaning within the narrative universe. And so incest might be a proxy for intimacy and a shorthand for this extreme trust that's expressed through these stories. But it doesn't literally mean that you want an incestuous relationship in the real world. And then the problem becomes, when you're not self-aware to know this. And I think, some people unfortunately have these situations where, knock on wood, it's not something as extreme as that, but maybe it's, violent sex, right? And they go out and they have an opportunity to try it and they're traumatized because it's not the story, right? It's not the same. Whereas the violent sex in the story might mean, or the role play might mean one thing. It doesn't mean that same thing in real life. And you get like a rude awakening. You're not quite as uh, much of a sexual libertine as you thought.
I spoke about this with Helen Joyce on the podcast recently, the fascination in fanfic with gay men. So fanfic written by and for young women generally, or women. And sometimes this is fanfic which represents gay men as basically like women who happen to be male. So they have very female sexuality and it's all very sort of intimate and romantic and everyone has long conversations about their feelings and stuff, right? Sometimes though, it can actually be quite porny and quite realistic representation of gay sexuality. And the question is why they're writing about that kind of sex from the gay perspective and not from the straight perspective. And I wonder if it's because there's an element of fear and vulnerability that's built into heterosexuality, particularly if a heterosexual woman is seeking out that kind of casual sex or violent sex or whatever, kind of at the extreme end of things. It's really dangerous to do that. So I wonder if one of the reasons that they'll try and like psychologically inhabit a man in thinking about that, fantasizing about that, is because it removes that element of vulnerability and danger.
Well, what's interesting is like, and I'll open up a little bit. Like, I was not quite in this community growing up, but like, if I had to choose an identity online, I would always choose male, right? But it wasn't really male, It was like this, like a gender thing, right? And it was because I didn't identify with female images, right? And so I thought like, oh, maybe that means that like there's something more attractive about a male character. I didn't think I was transgender or anything. But there was like this desire to like separate myself from a female archetype. And I think this is like, I think a lot of people actually experience this and they confuse it with this is the gender that I am. But really what it is like you're put in this weird position when you're forced to choose an image, right? And there's something uncomfortable about it. And the thing with slash or yaoi, which is the Japanese version of it, these male on male pairings, um, the it the, this I mean this is this question about gender has been it's been an open question for decades, right? Like they're not really men, but they're not women either, right? It's this like nebulous thing. And I think, there is a part of it of like, um, it brings it back home. It's more real. It's more grounded if it's a woman. But I think another part of it is like, it's somehow this acknowledgement that it's fantasy. It's separated. You don't identify with the image. The images that are like, particularly in Japanese society, a lot of fujoshi, which is the name for people who consume this type of content and are dedicated fans of it, that they'll say that the role for women is so limited, so narrow, that it doesn't lend itself to the story. This isn't how I conceive of women, right? And so I think part of it is also like being less prescriptive about what it means to be a woman. And even though, we live in this sort of like postmodern age where anyone can be anything, we still do have these like kind of prescriptive images for what a woman can be and what a woman is. And people rebel against it and it turns into this weird, it's like, it's very difficult to explain or express. And the closest language we have is like, this is the opposite gender.
Do you think there's an element of, particularly for the teenage girls, I don't, internalized misogyny isn't really the right term, or is maybe an overused term, but Helen Joy said she spoke to one woman who's now older, but is very into this fanfic world, and she said that I just really wanted to read a romantic story with no women in it, or indeed read any kind of story with no women in it, like this fantasy of just removing the women, very attractive to a woman. And I guess one way of interpreting that from a more sort of radical feminist perspective is that there's a deep-seated hatred of yourself and of other women in there.
I think that's possible, and I think that might also be part of this like disconnect of not being able to identify with the images of womanhood that are presented to you, and instead of creating an image of womanhood that does resonate with you, you just move to. And again, I hesitate to really say it's strictly like male, right? Because the you know they're not classically masculine. They're not classically feminine either, but they're in this weird liminal space where they're kind of neither nor. They're really just these vessels for sexual expression.
How does this mess up women's sexuality in the real world, do you think? Do you think women who are very into this fiction are more likely to just withdraw from real sexual relationships?
I don't think it causes them to withdraw. I think they're because they're withdrawn, they're attracted to it, and it may reinforce these. It may reinforce uh, the isolation, but I don't think it causes it. Um, and, when I talk to people and sort of the spell is broken, it's because they did meet someone they have a connection with, and this happens with men and porn periodically. Male porn addiction obviously functions differently, but like men who, for example, um, would rather be with like an anime woman, right, and are just like nonstop scrolling pictures of 2D ladies, right? What breaks the spell for them, my sample size is limited, but it's like it's actually so lame and sort of fairy tale esque, but it's like true love, right? It's feeling seen in a real way, and that's true of women too. And so the question is why is it so difficult for people to feel comfortable and feel seen?
Femcels. I remember when I first um, like ventured into femcel Reddit at a friend's suggestion, and this was I think quite a long time before we met, and I found it the most startlingly depressing place
It's
because
fem cells are very sad.
yeah, yeah, because I guess what it was is that I just never really thought it's because of that thing I guess I mentioned already that women even you have to be very very unattractive as a woman to not have access to sex with men at all, but it's actually quite possible to not have access to romance and to intimacy and to committed relationships, which is normally what femcels are complaining about. I mean, you tell me, you know more about this world than I do.
I think so. There's two kinds of fem cells, I think, um, or maybe more than two kinds, right? There's a kind who you describe who feel invisible, whether or not they are in reality, um, and those I think are very often their voices are suppressed, right? Because we don't want to believe that's even possible. That like you could be and they're women who conceive of themselves as being beneath even being a sexual object, and it's heartbreaking to read and interact with them in any capacity. And there's I think there's a small number of these women who consumed like the most toxic manosphere content, and internalized it. um there's women who uh, are more like radical feminists. They're scared of men. They're scared of sexual assault, and so they don't want that. I mean, that's why they're not able to have fulfilling relationships, whether it's because of real trauma or they're using it as like a post hoc rationalization for their loneliness. It's unclear. I think there's probably a mix of both. And then there's women who are sort of, like lost, and they're able to have these like unsatisfying hookups, but they can't get someone to stay. And that happens for all sorts of reasons too. And I think this is true of men too, where we don't, we want there to be like blanket explanations, but it's so based on other factors that rarely come up in the conversation, like class and what city you live in and what career you're in. Um, what age you are certainly impacts it. If you're in college, which school do you go to? Then there's the role dating apps play, and there's all these different factors for why these conditions emerge, and it's a much more complicated problem than um, like sex is free and everyone's a liberty. you know, there's a there's a lot of things that there's a lot of things that impact it.
Why don't we talk about femcels as much as we talk about incels?
Well, there's a violence thing, right? Incels sort of made themselves known. Um, when incels were first becoming, I think I was in my senior year of college when incels first sort of penetrated the mainstream conversation, right? Um, and then they became sort of this boogeyman, right? And then of course once you create a boogeyman, you create a counter market of people who are standing up for them, right? And then this isn't even touching the real community. And so there was no like market need to acknowledge the femcel. But around 2018, um, they started forming femcels started forming communities that were like more discreet, and they started using the name femcel. They had existed in different capacities. Obviously, you could find them sort of on Reddit. You could find them on like Red Pill Women, um, or Forever Alone Women is another one. And then you have true femcels emerge in 2018, and this is like right when like we're really heating up the scary incels, right? And it took, um, it took them becoming it took the word femcel becoming a slang term that's totally divorced from its original meaning, uh, and that being picked up by like youth publications like ID and Days and stuff for for us to really start talking about them.
How are they using it that's different?
They use it sort of interchangeably with a subculture called coquette, which is also known as nymphette. Back, they were like, "Oh, nymphette's attracting the wrong people. We just let's step away from that word." But it's sort of this sad girl, Lana Del Rey, Mary Janes, and Bose, and things like that. And they were being called femcels, or like female manipulators, or like toxic women. Um, but really, like, if you look at, I mean, if you look at like, like real femcel content, it's actually like, it's not the despair of being like like this beautiful doll who's listening to, a Lana Del Rey album on her fainting couch. It's like feeling, just like abject ugliness and loneliness and, you know, things that I won't even venture into.
Yeah, I mean, kind of telling, I guess, that media would reinterpret femcels to be sexy in that way when they are definitionally not.
Right, and then you have this, and then you have people saying like, oh, like the average femcel is like 20 plus bodies, and like actually is really hot, and it's like ignoring a bunch of guys in her DMs. But it's really like there's even such a stark difference between sort of like the radical feminist femcel, or the femcel who does have just simply unsatisfying sexual encounters. And I don't want to diminish their experiences, because it is difficult, and it's a life that is filled with despair. But there's this other kind that I just feel like doesn't get acknowledged at all, which is like, real or imagined, they just feel like nobody sees them, and that they're subhuman, and that's a word that they use. And it's deeply depressing. And we just don't want to believe that any woman can be like that. But I mean, there's many different ways for a woman to end up in that situation, and whether or not it's self-inflicted. If we're going to talk about beauty standards, right, there are going to be women who take that uh, to the extreme, and it's not that going to be hypersexual, they'll go in the other direction. They'll say, I could never achieve this, so I'm just not going to try.
I think last time you came on the podcast, we talked about female to female transsexuals and male to male transsexuals. But so I guess to return to a theme, something like bimbofication as another internet subculture. You know, these are often women who are. I was thinking also about real life Barbies. I did a lot of research on real life Barbies a little while ago because I was writing a piece for the Spectator about um, cosmetic surgery, and the Barbie was the peg, the film, and these women, and less frequently men, make themselves look so strange through their cosmetic interventions that they almost enter femcel territory, or they enter will only be attractive to fetishists territory. And I mean, as this is a long-standing view about anorexia as well, that sometimes the reason that women will get really into these subcultures which involve, or you know, mental illnesses which involve changing their bodies, is because they actually don't want male attention.
I think that's true. I mean, it and now the conversation's sort of muddied because you have people who want to be sexually attractive, but let's say they can't afford to keep up with their fillers, so they go to a discount provider or something, and then they end up disfigured, or maybe not disfigured, but not they don't look as good as they would have if they were able to pay more money, right? And they end up sort of in like accidentally in that same realm as people who are sort of self-consciously doing body modification to make themselves unattractive. I mean, something that might be interesting for you to look into is like, there's a number of now very I don't want to say very popular, but like, at least have some sort of like subcultural cachet, transgender influencers who, or maybe not even influencers, but these cult figures, right? Who started off in the extreme body modification community, right? With like lots of tattoos or piercings, um, and at least one of them has like a incredibly like traumatic past, um, and I think it's all sort of the same. It's sort of the same soup expressed in different ways. And the scary thing is like, I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to go down that path. But it's a self conscious choice to do that to your body, right? It's not necessarily one that makes people happy, but they know what they're doing is the point. It's when that gets confused with like, oh, well, I'm just a little filler in my lips, and then you end up in sort of the same category by accident. Various different kinds of accidents. I think it's very depressing.
You mean that people can get a little bit of filler and then end up kind of escalating, or do you mean they get falsely confused for?
They end up escalating. They can't afford the best treatments. They're trying to keep up. They develop body dysmorphia, and they're sort of accidentally engaging in this extreme body modification because they don't have the proper guardrails to stop them. But the intention was never to isolate themselves or sort of transcend their their given birth identity. And I think that happens much more now than it did in the past. Whereas in the past, you'd see someone who's a living Barbie, right? Like you researched, or has undergone this sort of extreme bimbofication, and they know what they're doing and they know what they're for. They may not be happy with it in the long term, but I mean, they're informed in a different way.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.